We talked about syndicalism and corporativism in the context of labor market theory, after we discussed the theory of price determination in the case of the factors of production. Now we will simply emphasize, as Mises does in Human Action, that the term syndicalism has different meanings. For instance, traditionally, it referred to a set of revolutionary strategies for implementing socialism. That was one meaning of the word syndicalism. The word also denoted an economic system in which the ownership of industries is transferred to workers. And when we studied socialism, we saw that it is impossible to coordinate society in that manner. Nowadays, syndicalism has taken on a much broader and more watered-down meaning. According to Mises, the word refers to a movement which aims to improve workers' standard of living. Well, if that is what people understand by syndicalism, then clearly syndicalists who study economic theory should defend above all an unhampered market economy and a capitalist system. For we already know that measures which redistribute wealth and those which attack capital raise taxes and increase economic regulations to harm mainly the working classes. The only way to achieve steady, sustainable growth in workers' standard of living is through a free market economy. As you already know, in a market economy, workers tend to be paid the discounted value of their marginal product, that is, the value of their contribution in the production process. And therefore, what workers need to be more productive and earn more is more well-invested capital available per worker. Consequently, the person to woo is the capitalist, so that he will save, and the entrepreneur, so that she will invest that savings wisely in an environment free of credit expansion. In this way, we will be increasingly productive, and hence we will earn more and more. The traditional measures of clumsy, short-sighted syndicalism, which have supposedly been aimed at improving workers' living standard, are all counterproductive. For instance, some measures restrict access to certain activities, guilds and professional associations. Others make membership in these associations or in unions obligatory, and others tend toward the creation of unnecessary jobs. All such measures are detrimental to society. They decrease productivity, and they increase poverty. Imagine a job can be done by one worker using one machine. Well, if unions insist on more shifts and more workers than necessary, the result is inefficient and antisocial. Also detrimental are measures supposedly designed to permit workers to share in the profits of companies. For the provision of his services, a worker tends to be paid the value of his contribution to the production process. A worker's share in the profits ends up being part of his wage. It forms part of the total labor cost. And if it exceeds a worker's marginal productivity, then it causes unemployment and a misallocation of resources. In short, if people truly and in good faith wish to pursue the syndicalist idea of improving the living standard of the working class, what they must do is to work toward a free market economy in which the accumulation of capital is encouraged. Borders are another interventionist measure. All restrictions on the free circulation of goods and services, that is, on international free trade, are harmful. They are restrictionist measures, as we were saying the other day. We were discussing Ricardo's law of association in its international trade version, the Ricardian law of comparative advantage. Protectionism harms everyone. It does not benefit anyone. Furthermore, it is like a drug. It causes a misallocation of resources, which, once in place, is very difficult to dismantle. In contrast, the free market benefits everybody. People all specialize in the activity at which they have the greatest relative comparative advantage, and then they exchange the products of their efforts. In other words, the best, cheapest, and most efficient way for the Swiss to buy oranges is to build watches. Of course, oranges can be produced in Switzerland, and they can be produced in, Greenland, but at a disproportionate astronomical cost. The cheapest way a Swiss can find to buy oranges or pay for a vacation in Spain is to make watches, and vice versa. The cheapest way a Spaniard can find to buy a watch is to grow oranges or start a business offering tourist accommodations on the coast. That is where our comparative advantage lies, as opposed to watchmaking in the case of the Swiss. Each person specializes in the activity at which he has a comparative advantage. and then he exchanges with others the fruit of his efforts. It would be crazy for us to wish to duplicate in Spain all of the production processes necessary to obtain the goods and services we need, even in those lines of production in which we are not competitive. It would be just as crazy for the Swiss to insist on growing oranges in the Alps. Thus, the essential principle is that international trade benefits everyone. And therefore, to the extent that borders are used as a pretext for creating tariff barriers, trade obstacles and so on, they impoverish rather than enrich. When, as in the European Union, there are no economic borders, there is no difference between international trade and the interregional trade, which, within Spain for instance, could take place between Catalonia, Palencia, Badajoz and Galicia, and an efficient allocation of resources tends to result. Please review all criticism of the myths about the balance of payments, like the idea that a surplus is desirable, but a deficit should be avoided, and the idea that obstacles should be put in the way of imports and exports should be encouraged. In short, all of the arbitrary notions about whether our balances are too high, and whether we are buying more or less than we should, etc. In the end, a balance of payments is simply an aggregate of the decisions of individuals, and ordinary human beings make their own decisions about what they must do. Indeed, in Spain, there is always a deficit in the trade balance of goods and services. But why? Because there is a massive influx of foreigners who come to spend their vacations in Spain. Tourism accounts for approximately 10% or more of the gross domestic product. And in fact, it should not surprise us that with the foreign currency these tourists leave us, we buy more goods abroad than we export. It makes perfect sense. The most important thing for you to keep in mind is that war is always the result of economic protectionism and regulation of the economy. State interventionism in economic matters tends to replace the harmonious social cooperation typical of a free market with violence and conflict. All of you who are true pacifists should, without a doubt, pursue a free market, a global free market without borders. Montesquieu writes, "Everywhere there is commerce, there are gentle mores." Instead of engaging in struggles, violence, conflict and theft, we must attempt to convince others to buy our products, and vice versa. And that approach ends in a handshake. The way to tear down walls and to end embargoes, violence and conflicts is to establish trade, because whenever people close a deal, both parties come out ahead. Furthermore, people remember that, and the next time around, relationships deepen, and so on. When the logic of free exchange in the capitalist free market economic system is replaced with the logic of intervention and protectionism, we enter the sphere of violence and conflict. What one nation gains, another loses. It is a struggle of all against all. Well, let us imagine we have not managed to avoid a war, says Mises. As economists, we can ask ourselves the following question. If we are at war, is it more advantageous for us to completely regulate the economy or to allow the market to function? This question was of practical interest when Mises was writing the first edition of Human Action, because World War II was raging. Mises noted that there were basically two strategies for dealing with the war, either to regulate the economy at all levels in an overarching statist system, Nazism or Marxism, or to leave the economy free. Well, Mises points out that wars are won by those who have the best weapons and the most resources, and that the way to achieve technological improvements and obtain higher quality weapons and more resources is to participate in the free market. In fact, there has never been a major conflict in which a capitalist economy has been defeated by a socialist economy. Poverty is always the result of socialism. Poverty does not arise from a country's lack of natural resources, for instance. Numerous cases illustrate the truth of what I am saying. Many countries are very poor in natural resources, like Switzerland. It has practically none. It has no mining resources, for example, only some snowy mountains and some grassland. Nevertheless, it is an extremely wealthy country. Why? Well, in Switzerland, the process of social cooperation takes place within an institutional environment in which private property, entrepreneurship, and the market economy are respected. and it would be impossible to imagine a poorer territory with more acute population problems than, say, Hong Kong. Yet its economy is very prosperous because it rests on the principles of private property and the market economy. In contrast, since socialism viewed as any system of institutional aggression against the free exercise of entrepreneurship blocks the innate creative capacity of human beings, it ruins our chances of devoting our ingenuity to trying to improve our lives and get ahead. So, think of any of the current or recent demagogues, people like Hugo Chavez. All nationalism, protectionism, expropriation of the assets of foreign capitalists, dividing up of wealth, taking from the rich to give to the poor, imposing progressive taxes on income and profits, going after those who have the most, all of these impoverish countries and bring them down. In fact, there are clear examples. It is very difficult to make historical comparisons, but some are more valid than others. For instance, there are countries which, due to certain circumstances, have split in two for prolonged periods, and one part has been socialist and the other capitalist, though both have started from the same capital base, cultural history, and so on. One case in point is East Germany and the Federal Republic of Germany. Up to the fall of the Berlin Wall, there was an enormous difference in income, quality of life, etc., in favor of the capitalist system over the socialist one. There are other examples. Before the market economy spread throughout large areas of mainland China, an obvious difference existed between nationalist China in Taiwan, which was prosperous and one of the Asian miracles, and communist China under Mao Zedong, which was very poor. We could also consider certain African countries separated by a border drawn simply with a pen and ruler, such as Kenya and Ethiopia. Ethiopia has been desperately poor. Relatively speaking, Kenya is richer. Why? Well, Ethiopia has been weighed down by Marxist, military, interventionist systems, under which entrepreneurs have been harassed, extremely heavy taxes have been imposed, a welfare state has been maintained, wheat has been given away for free in Addis Ababa, farmers have been ruined, and so on. This is significant because intuition leads us in one direction, and economic analysis leads us in another. It opens our eyes, and we become aware of the great burden of demagogy inherent in many prescriptions for supposedly encouraging economic development. Lord Bower was a development economist and professor of economics at the London School of Economics, and he realized that the concept of the Third World could be defined only by focusing on the sole common denominator of all developing countries. According to Lord Bower, a developing country is a country that receives development aid. That is the defining characteristic of a developing country. Bower's article is called Foreign Aid and its Hydra-Headed Rationalization. Believe it or not, when development aid is given, when aid is given to combat poverty, poverty is generated. For example, food stamps are provided to single mothers and low-income families in the United States. You cannot even imagine the effect of such programs. Single mothers come out of the woodwork. There is an incentive to be a single mother. Oddly enough, as sad and hard as it is to say, if out of pity you give money every day to someone with no arms who waits for you in a certain place, on a particular corner, at a specific traffic light, in some neighborhood in Madrid, then you are sure to see that person every day, precisely because you are providing him or her with a source of income. If you give money to a destitute person, you can be certain the person will remain destitute. There are other very powerful examples, like UN aid distributed in refugee camps in the Congo to those who fled Rwanda. I spoke with some nuns who told me that many thousands of people spent months and months, even years, in those refugee camps, until the problem in Rwanda was resolved and they were told they could return to their farms. Do you know what their reaction was? They said, "Go back to our farms?" In other words, go back to work on our farms from 6 o'clock in the morning till 10 o'clock at night, milking cows and growing crops? No, we want to go on as we have these last 3 years, with people bringing us powdered milk and shoes and everything we need. So you see, there is aid that kills. And if you have a child and you give him everything he asks for, you will be making a huge mistake, because you will destroy him. The way to truly help people is not to give them fish, but to give them rods and teach them to fish. That is, in an institutional environment in which private property is respected, creative entrepreneurship is fostered, and all people can take ownership of the fruits of their entrepreneurial creativity and freely exchange them with others. This is what is needed. The quick way to help others escape underdevelopment is to foster the redesign of institutions. Why is Africa poor? It is poor because it is immersed in endless civil and tribal warfare. And there is no respect for private property, nor any guarantee that one day you will be able to enjoy what you manage to grow, accumulate, and invest. Anyone who wishes to foster economic development must promote an environment of respect for private property and support for entrepreneurship, not just aid. Aid is food for today and hunger for tomorrow, quite literally. Well, the article describes in depth the pitfalls of aid and the great lie in the area of international aid. Listen, there are a number of civil servants. The article examines this closely. I will not dwell on it. These international civil servants live in idyllic circumstances in developing countries. They have magnificent homes, Mercedes-Benzes, and many domestic workers. They are international civil servants devoted professionally to the field of aid. They have an interest in the continuance of the aid mechanism, which makes countries dependent, for if it ceases to operate, aid professionals lose their high social status in the countries in question. They propose grandiose projects removed from reality, when what must be fostered in poor countries is the spontaneous micro-entrepreneurship that arises in a market economy. And that is not to mention the typical scenario in which the aid that arrives in needy countries goes to the local mafias, the local governments, and they monopolize it, immediately channel it into the black market, sell it at astronomical prices, and pocket the difference. Do not think I have dreamed all of this up. It is what actually takes place. The entire farce of international aid, the 0.7% of GDP Western countries decide to devote to aid to somehow ease their guilty conscience for having harmed third world countries through the common agricultural policy by, for instance, as we discussed the other day, flooding international markets with needlessly produced agricultural products. Then, by paying 0.7% in aid, we somehow hope for a redistribution of income from rich to poor countries. What all of this does is doom those countries to poverty, just as we doom a destitute person to poverty if we give him or her money. We remove people's incentives to fight, to get ahead in life, and to make creative attempts to boost their own entrepreneurship. So, aid kills. Aid given to combat poverty generates poverty, and the policy of third world aid is a policy of hunger. Only private initiative, which is very close to the needy, can tell us how far we can go in giving, what causes dependence and what does not. When emergency situations arise due to earthquakes and the like, of course people bend over backwards to help, and those near the scene arrive much sooner than large bureaucratic organizations like UNICEF, the UN, and so on. By the time these get there, an entire network of private associations are already taking care of the problem. Things have worked this way for decades and centuries. Or do you think there were no earthquakes 100 or so years ago? There were earthquakes, and yet people recovered from them with no problem. For example, an earthquake hit San Francisco in 1906. The government did not have to intervene at all. Rent prices skyrocketed, and the problem was immediately solved. Many people living in homes that had not been destroyed did some calculations and said, well, I have 2 extra rooms. I will rent them out. Well, I am going to set up a little tent business. And spontaneously, without any organization, the housing problem which arose following the 1906 San Francisco earthquake and fires was solved. The public choice school was founded mainly by 2 economists, Gordon Tullock and especially James Buchanan. Buchanan takes the following approach. He says, so, you equilibrium economists believe you perceive failures in the market. Well, for the sake of argument, we will assume that is true. And you believe that, prima facie, that is, from the start and automatically, these market failures justify the intervention of the state. This is where I call your position into question. we will take a look at how the democratic state functions. We will examine, in analytical terms, the political framework in which authorities, that is, democratically elected politicians, voters who vote for them, and bureaucrats or civil servants in charge of implementing the corresponding laws act in an interrelated manner. So, public choice theorists carried out an analytical study of the ways in which such groups and processes operate, and the theorists concluded that regardless of what happens in the private sector, the democratic public sector is beset with failures that are far more serious than those which may occasionally arise in the private sector. As we have already seen, from the dynamic perspective of the Austrian school, there is a tendency to constantly avoid, detect and correct errors, with no systematic failures in the private sector. We are going to consider basically 5 reasons why democracy, democratic public management, is much less efficient than the private management that takes place via the market process driven by entrepreneurship. The first reason democratic public management is highly inefficient lies in what public choice theorists have called the principle of rational ignorance. This means that voters immediately detect or realize, either explicitly or implicitly, that their votes are actually irrelevant. And indeed, those of us who have voted are in a sense all idiots, because if in the last elections you had not voted, or you had voted the opposite way, the result would have been exactly the same. To put it another way, when a vote is taken, like when a general election is held in Spain, in which perhaps 20 or 25 million people vote, the probability of your vote being the deciding vote, which determines that certain people win instead of others, is 1 divided by 20 million. And just to give you an idea of how remote that is, the odds of winning the Christmas lottery jackpot are 200 times greater. So, one person's vote is practically insignificant. You could say to me, "But Professor, if everyone did that, then nobody would vote, and the candidates from my party would not win." Well, if that is what you think, try it. Go out and campaign. Shout. Roam the streets with a bullhorn. Whatever you want. But on election day, sleep in. Tell people you have voted, and the result will be the same. What effect does our awareness of the insignificance of our vote have? It has a public good effect, for voting with a full knowledge of the facts is not in the interest of the vast majority of voters. It is absurd. Voting with a full knowledge of the facts means carefully studying the political platforms, with all of their implications. Of course, this takes hours. It takes time and money. So, if I insist on being a fully informed voter, I bear the entire cost of the effort it takes. However, the benefit of my being a fully informed voter is spread out among millions of voters. I have just observed that the vote of any of us is insignificant, that the probability of our vote being the deciding vote is 1 divided by 20 million. Well, if I bear the entire cost of an activity, but the benefit is spread out among 20 million people, what is the result? The result is that being a fully informed voter who has considered all the angles and all the implications is not in the interest of anyone. So, what do we base our votes on? Well, we base them on emotional considerations and passions, like when we go to a soccer game. I want Real Madrid or Barca to win, and the other team to lose. We have tribal motivations. We think of good guys and bad guys, and we see this in every campaign. The low level of debate, the weak arguments, the demagogic justifications offered by the different candidates, the taboo arguments that cannot be voiced, the television debates in which one can speak for only 30 seconds, and everything depends on whether one is liked or not, and so on. We may even vote based on gut feelings. Those people are Francoists, or those people are leftists, but we do not vote with a full knowledge of the facts, because that involves a cost we would have to bear, and there would be no benefit to us, since our vote is insignificant. This negatively skews democratic public management in all democracies, even the most well-established ones. There may be differences of degree between countries, but all are beset with the same problem. However, it is not the only problem. There is a second effect, which tends to make democratic public management even more harmful, and that is the privileged special interest group effect, which is perverse. Special interest groups are relatively small groups of people and agents who discover they share a very specific incentive. If they manage to secure the support of an authority, and that person grants them a subsidy or assists them in some way, they gain quite a lot. However, the cost of that subsidy, assistance or privilege is spread out among millions of taxpayers. So, note that the members of an interest group do have an incentive to take action, to pressure authorities, and to sell their votes, because they know they stand to gain something extremely valuable. What is more, they are very likely to obtain it, because no one bothers to defend the silent majority. The cost of that assistance or privilege is spread out among millions of taxpayers, whom no one defends. Any time a particular group identifies a great potential benefit, they have an immediate incentive to launch into action and apply political pressure to gain that benefit, and at the expense of others, as is logical. So, what does democracy become? It becomes a kind of free-for-all. Most citizens vote based on gut feelings, and they have little interest in becoming informed, because that entails a huge cost, and their votes are insignificant. However, many small groups do act to pursue political advantages. Anyone can be in such a group. It will always be argued that the goal is to serve the common good or noble causes, but groups can promote any interest. You can choose any group of people, for instance, farmers or Hunosa miners, or feminists, or abused women, or the victims of drug addiction, or university students. All are privileged special interest groups. The government attracts all of them like a magnet, because it offers them advantages in exchange for their votes. So, what I am saying is that in the end, democracy is hijacked, so to speak, by privileged special interest groups, in an environment in which no one worries about defending the silent majorities, among other reasons because if a candidate tried to do so, he or she would lose the election. There is also a third very powerful effect that disrupts and makes democratic public management inefficient, and that is the bundle purchase effect, or the fact that democratic representation is non-binding. Every 4, 5, or 6 years, depending on the system, politicians promise us the moon, and they always identify interest groups or areas in order to buy votes. But then, once they win an election, they can do whatever they want, because representation is non-binding. That is, unlike in the private sector, we cannot say, "Listen, Mr. Zapatero, Mr. Rajoy, Mr. Aznar, or Mr. Gonzalez, you promised me 800,000 new jobs, and you have not followed through. I am going to take you to court and sue you." No, ladies and gentlemen. Representation is non-binding. The politician will say circumstances have changed, or he has changed his mind, and he will do whatever he wants, and you cannot demand anything of him. Furthermore, in many systems, people vote for closed lists, as is the case in Spain, for instance. We cannot elect the specific representative we want. Still, this is a secondary problem, which exacerbates the main problem we are discussing. But take note, what citizen is going to become a fully informed voter and spend hours studying the platforms, if she not only knows that her vote is irrelevant, but also knows that, even if it were significant, the politician could then do as he pleased, since representation would not bind him to anything. Political office would not bind him to anything except in a political sense. He could say, "Ah, well, I do as I wish. Circumstances have changed. If you disagree with me, your only option is to avoid voting for me in 4 years. By that time, I will have found a way to manipulate you again, to cook up another interest group, and to tempt you with another subsidy or some kind of assistance." Now we come to the fourth effect which public choice theorists have studied, and which explains the failure of democratic public management. We can sum it up by calling it the government short-sightedness effect. Dear students, Politicians have a very short time horizon. They are concerned only about the next election, and all of their political action is skewed by this concern. Their incentive is to win the next election, which will roll around in, at most, 4 years. So they have a very limited time horizon. In contrast, in the private sector, entrepreneurs are constantly making decisions which will exceed even their lifetime horizon, like decisions involving long-term investments, perhaps the planting of trees, which may take 20, 30, 40 years to grow, and so on. People think, I will not see the results, but my children and grandchildren will. None of these long-term decisions exist for politicians. A statesman who makes decisions based on long-term criteria and on what he believes is best for his country is a politician doomed to lose the election. What a politician must do is maximize votes now, tomorrow. You will have experienced this, and you will experience it again and again. Whenever an election approaches, this conditions the debate, what we hear on TV, and what politicians say. I have seen it up close in one of the parties, and it is as clear as day to me. The advisers warn, be careful, we are in an election season. You cannot say that. They openly admit this. And indeed, you cannot say it, because even if you are convinced that it must be said, if you say it, you will lose the election. Government short-sightedness. Not surprisingly, politicians are interested only in elections. This does not mean they are bad people. It is just that in the democratic institutional framework in which they move, the next election acts as the incentive. There is a fifth reason democratic public management fails, and it involves the participation of civil servants or bureaucrats. You see, civil servants or bureaucrats, who are the people in charge of enforcing authorities' commands by following regulations, lack incentives to act efficiently. It is not that civil servants or bureaucrats are bad people. Believe it or not, they are just as good and just as bad as you or I. They are people, human beings like you and like me. The thing is that you and I act in a certain way in the context of a private company, where we risk our own money and are responsible for a profit and loss account. If we are placed in a bureaucratic environment, in the public sector, we act differently. In the public sector, there is no profit and loss account. No civil servant risks her own money. They all order drinks on the house. In other words, they spend other people's money. And here is an example I gave in class, at least in the last course. I am willing to bet you have never seen a single civil servant call a press conference and announce the following to all the expectant newspaper, radio and TV journalists. We wish to inform citizens by all available means that, having carried out a scientific, in-depth analysis of our department, be it against drugs or in defense of women or whatever, we have concluded that the cost of our department to citizens exceeds the benefit we provide, and therefore I have asked my minister to dissolve our department and let us all go. Never. Not in the past, not in the present, nor in the future. You will never hear a civil servant say such a thing. No matter how absurd her department is, a civil servant does not make such a request. What does a civil servant want? What motivates a person in a bureaucratic environment? Well, she wants to climb the job ladder, to have more civil servants working under her, to gain prestige, and to have a larger budget. And that is what a civil servant will always request, regardless of her department, whether it concerns public works, or education, or the mistreatment of women, or drug addiction. The pattern is always the same. My department is essential, and here are some important examples which illustrate that. I am facing a very grave problem. However, I do not have enough resources. I need a larger budget allocation. I need more civil servants working under me, more police officers, etc. Then my problem will be solved. That is the usual pattern. I repeat, it is not that civil servants are bad people. It is simply that, in a context in which they are not responsible for a profit and loss account, and they do not risk their own money, the institutional framework leads them to make that request. It does not matter what nonsense they are in charge of. This is the fundamental reason for the megalomania or unchecked expansion of the state. Once a commission or a department has been created, it is impossible to get rid of it. I had a good laugh the other day because someone told me that in Italy, a ministry had been created, an actual government department, to deregulate the work of the other ministries. Is this true or not? A ministry for reducing red tape. Do you think this will result in fewer civil servants? On the contrary, it will result in twice as many civil servants and commissions, more people trying to bring order to the chaos, and therefore, ultimately and inevitably, more chaos. Consequently, in light of the fact that it is not in voters' interest to become fully informed before we vote, and the fact that we are the victims of privileged interest groups, and the fact that politicians concern themselves only with the short term and not the long term, and the fact that civil servants are not limited by a profit and loss account and consistently request more resources and regulations, it should not surprise you that the democratic system is a highly inefficient and imperfect system, which produces chaos and disorder in society. Furthermore, it creates perverse incentives for citizens to stop acting in a harmonious manner, and the moment anyone's privilege is threatened, everybody goes out into the streets to protest. Greece provides a recent example of this. Everybody went out into the streets. But why? We were promised we could all retire at the age of 60. Listen, in the Federal Republic of Germany, which is much richer, people retire at 67. No, I have a right to retire at 60. And everybody was protesting in the streets. Once a privilege is granted, remember that socialism and state interventionism are like drugs. It is practically impossible to do away with it. We must keep in mind, dear students, that the social security system is in the grip of a deep crisis. And this crisis is of a twofold nature. On one hand, it is a technical crisis, and we will see what it consists of in a moment. On the other hand, it is an ethical crisis. In fact, the technical and the ethical aspects go hand in hand. They are closely related. We will see that technical deficiencies cause grave injustices, and that the erroneous concept of social justice, on which social security rests, makes the technical crisis inevitable. What does the technical crisis of social security involve? Well, basically, it involves the system by which social security is financed. This system is called, please take good note, a pay-as-you-go financing system. In terms of social security technique, what is a pay-as-you-go financing system? Well, it is one in which benefits, that is, retirement, widowhood, and orphan pensions, are paid each year out of the social security contributions received either from people who are working or from their employers. In a pay-as-you-go system, current benefits are paid out of the revenue for the current year. You need to understand that this has some extremely significant economic effects. First, the pay-as-you-go social security system acts as a false substitute for individual saving. If citizens believe that when they retire, those who are working will pay their benefits just as they are now doing for their own elders, citizens will see saving as unnecessary. This is true to the extent that citizens expect the pay-as-you-go method to continue in use and to be sustainable generation after generation. However, in practice, it is not. Among other reasons, because the negative impact on saving means that economic growth is much lower than it could actually be. There are economic studies which show that those countries with the most developed pay-as-you-go social security systems have a significantly lower savings rate than those countries without social security systems, or with systems of much more limited scope. And this detrimental effect on saving also plays a key role in making economic cycles worse. As we already know, crises and recessions spring from a shortage of saving. They arise when too much is consumed and too little is saved. Thus, a recession and a crisis are felt much more strongly in Spain, apart from other reasons due to the great rigidity of the labor market. Traditionally, very little has been saved in Spain, since the social security system is financed using the pay-as-you-go method. In addition to this effect on saving, there is a second, far more problematic effect, and it has to do with biometrics, actuarial biometrics if you will. As you will all understand, if contributions are taken from current workers and immediately used to pay the pensions of retirees, then if there is a gradual aging of the population, this so-called intergenerational solidarity, which supposedly rests on the working generation's support of the retired generation, is thrown into crisis. If something characterizes economic development, it is that it raises life expectancy. Improvements in healthcare, for instance, greatly increase the average age of death. According to recent Spanish mortality tables, out of every 5 women who reach the age of 65, 20%, lives to be 100 years old. Economic development is also characterized by a slowing of the birth rate. People marry later. They are more selective when it comes to having children. They take better care of them, and so on. On the one hand, the birth rate is slowing. On the other hand, people are living longer and longer. The average age of death is tending to rise. We are witnessing what is referred to as a gradual aging of the population. The percentage of the population over the age of 65 is getting larger and larger. To give you an idea, when General Franco established the pay-as-you-go social security system in Spain in 1964, there was 1 retiree for every 6 active workers. Today, the ratio is 1 retiree to every 2 active workers. In other words, because the population is gradually aging as an inevitable result of economic development, the cost of supporting the retired generation using the pay-as-you-go system snowballs. And invariably, this phenomenon has been observed in all countries with Bismarck-type continental European social security systems, which are based on the pay-as-you-go method. The first such system was established in 19th century Germany by Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor, and it later perversely spread to the rest of the countries, at least those of continental Europe. There is a third significant technical consideration, namely that from the standpoint of economic theory, the total amount contributed to Social Security, that is, not only what the worker nominally pays, but also every last euro an employer pays for a worker, is paid entirely by the worker. The worker pays it because it is part of the worker's total labor cost to the employer. Instead of paying 27 or 28% of each salary into the Social Security system, as the employer is doing now, he or she would not mind giving it directly to the worker and saying, "Listen, here is your money. Do whatever you want with it and fend for yourself." It would certainly be a giant step toward reform, and in the right direction, if in Spain, for instance, all wages were expressed in gross terms. That way, workers would know that with the contribution made to Social Security by their employers, workers are actually earning 50% more than they are being told. There would be a huge outcry for reform, because people would do their calculations and say, "Listen, between the 27% of my wages and the 6%, we are talking about a third. 1/3 of all I earn is going to Social Security. Give it to me directly. I have made my calculations, and there is enough for me to pay Sanitas for private healthcare insurance for my whole family. I can also take out retirement insurance or a pension plan. And if I start working at the age of 25 or 30, by 65 I may have accumulated €1 million and secured for myself a much higher pension than the one politicians are promising I will receive from the public pay-as-you-go system. In fact, politicians are not in a position to fulfill that promise, and when the time comes, they will pay me a fraction of what they have promised, and only if the circumstances are favorable. Now we will comment on the ethical problems which Social Security poses, and which, as we will see, go hand in hand with the technical inadequacies we have just mentioned. The first ethical problem I would like to point out is the following. The pay-as-you-go financing system is clearly unjust because it offers no guarantee. In other words, Social Security provides no security. It is not an insurance policy. If it were, having paid would give me a right to something. With Social Security, you have no right to anything. Most citizens are unaware of this. They do not realize that everything they have paid in contributions has already been spent in the year, and that therefore the payment of pensions in the future, when we retire, will depend on political circumstances in the future. It will depend on uncertain economic prospects 20 or 30 years from now, and at that time, our having contributed to the system will be completely irrelevant. Therefore, Social Security certainly provides no security. If the number of years used to calculate our pensions is increased, and our pensions are reduced, as has happened many times in the past, as it stands now, no one can file a lawsuit in the courts and say, "Listen, I was promised this and that." You will be able to do that if you take out retirement insurance via a private contract, and the company fails to honor its commitments. However, there is no type of contract that can be enforced in any court because politicians change the conditions and announce they are going to reduce pensions. When pensions are cut, it is always done more or less euphemistically, more or less secretly. For instance, by changing the number of years used to calculate the average that will determine the pension you will be entitled to. If the number of years is increased, and instead of 10 years, 15, 20 or 25 years are used, and in the earliest years your wages were lower, then that is a way of reducing your pension. Another way is to say, as politicians have recently said, "Listen, instead of retiring at 65, you will be able to retire at 70. Any combination of these methods may be used." There is a second grave ethical problem, and that is the extremely doubtful ethical legitimacy of placing on the shoulders of our children the increasing and intolerable burden of maintaining our pensions in the future. How can we, without asking for their consent, transfer to our children an increasing financial burden that is becoming intolerable? It should not surprise us to see them rebel if, in the future, each active worker must support one retiree, or a retiree and a half, and the responsibility becomes intolerable. Our children may well have a right to refuse. No one asked them if they agreed in the first place. The current system generates unnecessary and insoluble conflicts and tensions between the different generations. Either the commitments will be met and young people who are working will be economically stifled as a result, or they will rebel and say, "No, we are not going to meet those commitments. We are going to reduce your pensions." Ultimately, it is a zero-sum game, in which some people win, others lose, and insoluble conflicts are all that is created. This is one of the greatest sources of potential social unrest in modern societies, and it is all due to the fact that the system technically rests on the erroneous pay-as-you-go method and a lack of capital accumulation. There is a third important ethical problem, and it is also mentioned in the reading. Specifically, I do not consider it ethical to curtail people's liberty, that is, to deprive entrepreneurs and workers of the freedom to set up whatever social security system they find most suitable. And I consider it particularly immoral to treat workers like small children who cannot do whatever they want with their money. As we have already seen, a very large part, more than a third, of all they earn goes to Social Security. Why not let workers have that money and decide for themselves how to finance their retirement and cover their healthcare risk? It comes as no surprise that Social Security was established by General Franco and devised by Bismarck. It is based on a fascist, paternalistic system. Social Security rests on an antiquated paternalism that is incompatible with true democracy and free, responsible citizens. Social Security is based on an astonishing paradox whose continued existence well into the 21st century is hard to believe. The paradox is that public affairs are managed according to the will of voters, but later, the very legislator considers these voters incapable of managing their own affairs, of arranging and financing with their own money the system of retirement and healthcare coverage they find most suitable. And let no one argue that if we were given that third of our salary, some people, due to a lack of foresight or bad luck, might not take out healthcare insurance or might reach retirement age without any savings. That is as absurd as saying, "Listen, if we allow everyone to take care of his or her own lunch and people work it out as they wish, when the end of the day comes, some people will not have eaten. Some will eat at Yuppie, others will go to Zalakain. Others will eat here at the university. Still others will go home to eat. Others will have brought a sandwich with them. And there may be some people who, due to a lack of foresight or bad luck, have not eaten. I have a solution. We will oblige all citizens to go to a mess hall and eat the same slop at the same time. That way, we will be sure that the minority of people who, owing to a lack of foresight or bad luck, cannot satisfy their need to eat will also have that need met. If someone presented such a plan to any of us, we would realize that it is crazy and absurd. However, in the area of Social Security, that is how the reasoning goes and how things are done. Under the pretext of protecting a minority of the population who, due to a lack of foresight or bad luck, may fail to take out health care or retirement insurance, all citizens are obliged, manu militari, to go to a mess hall. That is, to participate in a coercive Social Security system in which over a third of all our earnings are taken from us, and we are rigidly forced to retire at a certain age, and to receive pensions which are determined politically and have nothing to do with our actual contributions. This brings us to the fourth problem. The public system is very rigid, and it seriously harms the chances older people have for personal and professional development. We have all had grandparents, and we know how traumatic retirement can be for many of them. In a free system, a broad range of retirement plans would be agreed upon, including partial retirement, which would allow people to continue working and contributing to the production process. Nowadays, if you retire and then engage in a professional activity, you are a criminal. Your pension is taken away, and you are put in jail. But why? Are you aware of the enormous human potential, especially now that we are living longer and longer, that is being wasted due to mandatory retirement in rigid systems? People are forced to retire. Presumably there are different ages at which, for whatever reason, people would freely choose to retire. Some people would wish to work their whole lives, while others would prefer to work part-time. There are a wide spectrum of combinations that are prevented by the current public Social Security system, which is rigid and inhumane, and uses a one-size-fits-all approach. The conclusion we reach, dear students, is that Social Security is a schizophrenic system which contains an inherent contradiction, since it is designed to achieve two mutually incompatible goals. The goal of individual equity is an attempt to somehow establish a connection between the contributions a person makes and the benefits he or she receives. And in order to fool citizens, that is how the system is presented. Though, as we have already seen, there are no guarantees when the time comes to draw a pension. This goal of individual equity is similar in a way to a principle that operates in the private insurance sector based on private contracts, and the attempt is made to reconcile this principle with that of social equity. Social equity is the principle of social justice, and it is based on providing benefits to the most needy, regardless of the contributions they have made. Well, the fact that the same pay-as-you-go institution coercively pursues both of these objectives, which are fundamentally incompatible, means that Social Security never provides any security, for, as we have just observed, there is no guarantee that 10 or 20 years from now we will actually receive the amount we have been promised today. There is no guarantee, hence there is no security. There is no individual equity. However, Social Security is not social either. The reception of benefits is made to depend on current contributions paid, and therefore many young people in difficult situations are contributing a third of their wages, an astronomical amount considering the little they earn. And that money is going to pay the pensions of millionaires. And I have nothing against millionaires, but I do have something against a rigid, one-size-fits-all public system which is designed to attain the best of both worlds, but which actually frustrates the attainment of these goals. Never forget, dear students, that Social Security is neither social nor security. It offers no guarantee of receiving benefits, nor can the system meet its objectives of social equity. And regardless of the Toledo Pacts of silence, and even if politicians try to seal their lips, we have no choice but to reform the Social Security system. The sooner the better. The longer we wait to reform the system, the greater the difficulties, conflict, violence and cost will be. And you may ask, Why do we not have statesmen explaining this to us? We have discussed this already, and statesmen who explained this would lose the election. You probably do not remember it, but there was a very famous TV debate between Felipe Gonzalez and Jose Maria Aznar, in which, with great cunning and skill, Gonzalez blurted out at Aznar, "What you intend to do is to cut," and he gave a number, 8,221 pesetas from retirement pensions. When he said 8,221, he seemed to be calculating, but he had made it up. Aznar lost the election. All the retirees voted for Felipe Gonzalez, and you can be sure that the same thing would happen today. The public choice school tells us why this cannot be the object of democratic debate, because anyone who explained the situation like a statesman would lose the election. But that makes no difference to me, because we are at a university, and we are here to study problems scientifically. It is impossible to conceive of any serious social security reform that does not rest on the basic principle of separating the two goals of individual equity and social equity and pursuing them via different institutions. The goal of individual equity must be pursued through the customary institutions of private insurance policies and savings based on capital accumulation. The goal of social equity, of helping the needy, who, for whatever reason, reach retirement age without means or lack sufficient health care coverage, will have to be achieved by way of freely given charity, and as a secondary measure, if worst comes to worst, a system of social assistance to those needy people who can demonstrate their need. But the two objectives must be separated, and a system based on capital accumulation and saving through private insurance is a system which would avoid all of the technical and ethical problems I have just commented on. If I save for my retirement, there is no longer a pay-as-you-go financing system. There is savings accumulation. Not only is this method not detrimental to societal saving, but it actually encourages saving. Those countries that have adopted pension systems based on capital accumulation, voluntary saving, retirement insurance, and pension plans, like the UK, Chile, and other countries, have greatly boosted their saving rate and are much more prosperous. If, in addition, everyone saves for retirement, the biometrics problem disappears. In fact, a longer life expectancy has a positive effect. If I am going to live longer, I am going to accumulate more, and I will have a larger pension for when I retire. All of the problems that stem from one generation supporting the other are avoided. There is no longer any injustice. Young people do not support older people, since people support themselves, based on the effort they have made to save throughout their lives. Of course, the transition does pose a problem. Even if the political decision is made, and it has been in some countries, to move from a public system to a private system, one generation is faced with a problem, namely that we must begin saving to accumulate the funds for when we young people retire. Nevertheless, we must continue to support current retirees while they are still with us. The generation that is active when the reform is adopted must pay twice. Also, there was a doubt about whether people would be willing to do it. Well, in all the countries in which this option has been offered, people have shown themselves willing to make the effort. The United Kingdom offered the option first, as the result of a pact between the two major political parties, the party on the left and the one on the right, the Labour Party and the Conservative Party. In the 1970s, the first step was taken in the reform of the public system, and contracting out was permitted. People were allowed to contract private pension plans outside the public system. Those who chose to contract out were obliged to continue paying 10% of their wages into the public system for the support of people who were already retired, and funds could be set up using only the money left over. Well, the option was offered. It might have failed. The vast majority of people might have said, "I am not willing to do that." Do you know what percentage of British workers decided to leave the public system? Over 95%. And the same was true in Chile and elsewhere. I am sure that if the option were offered in Spain and people did their calculations, the vast majority of workers would take it. In fact, we do have what may be a rather illustrative sample in the specific area of healthcare, and this is less problematic. because it involves the competitive provision of services. In the specific area of healthcare, there are 2 million privileged people in Spain who can choose to leave the public system and go to the private system. Do you know who those 2 million privileged people are? Civil servants, and I am one of them. Civil servants belong to MUFACE, and MUFACE allows us to choose between the public and private healthcare systems. Do you know what percentage of civil servants have left the public healthcare system and have gone to the private system? Almost 90%. I ask you, is it not a glaring injustice that civil servants can do that, but the rest of the Spanish people cannot? It is an absolute outrage. Why can the rest of the Spanish people not do the same? No, the rest of the Spanish people are stuck in the public system. Furthermore, many of them, 4 million, are paying twice, because they are also paying for a private policy in Adeslas, Sanitas, or another of the private healthcare companies. So, think about the duplication of effort and the absurdity of the situation. And let us not talk about Obamacare, which is a joke. People were saying, there are 325 million people living in the United States, and 45 million of them have no health care. Do you know what Obama's reform plan consists of? It consists simply of forcing insurance companies to accept at a certain premium even people with disabilities, and in exchange, the 45 million uninsured people are forcibly compelled to take out insurance, and anyone who does not purchase coverage has to pay a heavy fine. Well, the 45 million uninsured people said that was unconstitutional, and they would take it to the US Supreme Court. We are not talking about 45 million destitute people. Do not believe that. The poor and the elderly in the United States have always had public health care coverage through Medicaid and Medicare. The 45 million people who have no private insurance do not want any private insurance. And the proof of that lies in the fact that when they were forced to join the system, they did nothing but complain, and they took the matter to the Supreme Court. They argue that it is an offense against individual liberty to force someone to buy something he or she does not wish to buy. As always, demagogy instead of rational analysis. State economic interventionism is in crisis in the sense that society cannot possibly be peacefully and permanently organized under its auspices. Why? The first reason Mises offers is that state interventionism in the economy restricts output and lowers the standard of living, especially that of workers. Second, as we have seen, any interventionist measure brings about effects which are harmful from the viewpoint of its original defenders' valuations. Third, Mises mentions that the state's capacity to act is limited by the amount of capital which can be expropriated. In the end, the state can intervene until it kills the goose that lays the golden eggs. After that, further intervention and expropriation are impossible. Fourth, regardless of the sphere it affects, interventionism invariably generates tensions and conflicts between the different social groups. It disrupts peaceful social cooperation. It provokes violence. It awakens violent habits in citizens who behave aggressively toward one another. Fifth, state interventionism in the economy is ultimately an unstable system, an unbalanced system which leaves room for only two possibilities. Either the interventionist measure brings about harmful effects, and attempts are made to resolve them using further interventionist measures until the economy is completely socialized, or the controlled market causes such conflict that there is a popular outcry for reform, and the government pulls back. But it is inconceivable for a society to rest indefinitely on state interventionism in the economy. At the end of the book, Mises asks himself a question my students have been asking me for many years. Professor, after all of the classes, the 75 you have taught, and after having done the readings, it is obvious to me what economic science teaches us. I am convinced. However, I do not understand why, if it is so obvious, the same errors are still being committed in the outside world. Why does this happen? My answer is always the same. Dear students, do not be naive and do not fall into the wishful thinking of the old liberals, who thought that because the teachings are quite clear and have been confirmed by economic science, people would naturally act sensibly. Mises tells us that we must begin by taking into account the uniqueness of economics as a science. Economic events can be interpreted in a wide variety of ways, and their correct interpretation depends on our first having developed a valid economic theory. This requires an intellectual effort. You may have a very clear understanding of the teachings, but that is partly because you have spent a year with me, and you have devoted hours to study. Who in the outside world devotes hours to study? In a political debate, extremely important matters which are central to our lives are dealt with in 30 seconds. That is not enough time to transmit even basic information. Furthermore, public opinion is manipulated. It is driven by intuition and political manipulations. Invalid theories and mistaken demagogic interpretations are constantly used to rally voters. And today, when we analyze the contributions of the public choice school, which earned Buchanan the Nobel Prize in Economics, we saw why this is true. Also, there is the very strong perverse effect exerted by privileged special interest groups, which are continually lobbying to maintain their privileges. If you scratch the surface behind any demagogic measure, you will detect which interest group it benefits, often in the shadows. As we have already seen, it is in the interest of politicians to hold on to power in the short term, rather than focus on the long-term common good of society. Democracy must be reformed. Is such a reform possible? I am very skeptical. Hayek devised a model for reform. Please read about it in the 3rd volume of Law, Legislation and Liberty. Hayek believed we could reform the system by electing representatives for a single prolonged term and establishing 2 legislative chambers. One chamber would be devoted to the daily business of government, and another, superior chamber, would be devoted to important laws. That would be a step forward and would deal a blow to demagogy. Still, I am highly skeptical. We professional economists have also done much harm. We have been trained to intervene. In a free economy, a professional economist would be like a philosopher, someone devoted to thinking, but the profession would have no market value. General economics programs teach social engineering, based on the equilibrium model, and prescriptions for intervention, and when these economists graduate, the only job opportunities they have consist of taking public exams for the civil service, and being specialists in intervention, advising privileged special interest groups, or becoming university professors. A university professor who teaches the view of economics I have presented here, based on entrepreneurship and dynamic market processes, is one of a rare breed. I have always described myself as a 5th columnist, a sort of virus introduced into the system to destroy it. For the most part, the university system is state-owned. Do you think it offers incentives to teach about dismantling the state? Other theorists, philosophers, jurists and politicians are completely unaware of how market processes operate, and all the incentives invariably lead them to request more intervention. Imagine a problem in any area, for instance, the judicial system. When people complain that the judicial system does not work, that rulings take a long time to obtain and are contradictory, that judges are inconsistent and so on, do you think anybody replies, "That is due to the tangled web of legislation, intervention and chaos. We need to increase legal certainty and reduce the number of laws. We need few laws within a framework of liberty." Does anybody say that? Nobody does. When people discuss the crisis of the judicial system, what do they call for? More judges, more courts, a larger budget. And do you think that more judges, more courts, and a larger budget are the answer to the problem of the judicial system? They will make the conflict even worse. We have looked at the difficulties today, and we understand what is behind them. Contrary to what the naive classical liberals of the 19th century thought, common sense does not necessarily prevail. In the long run, the correct theories do prevail, without a doubt. The truth wins out. It is just that the long run may be very long. What can we do? Well, we can, and we have a personal responsibility to, advance sound economic theory. This has been the first year you have come into contact with these ideas. We have the readings. There is more literature on the subject. We must study. And in every context, discussion, and meeting with friends, Let us take the lead. We will always be swimming against the tide, but we will attract people. Word gets around quickly. You know, this man or this woman has attractive ideas that go against the current. We will convince others. That is our mission. That is our obligation. It is also important to train good economists, and our master's program in Austrian economics is in its 10th year. Publish books, direct doctoral theses, contribute to scientific journals, etc. We must also educate the theorists of other fields in sound economic theory. I am talking about jurists, philosophers, sociologists, and students. We must influence public opinion through books, lectures, and newspaper articles, and we must try to reform democracy. We must secure the support of politicians. Poor politicians. I feel sorry for them. Politicians act as if they were always looking in the rear-view mirror, a posteriori, concerned about the polls. This does not mean they have no leeway to act. If we can get a free market politician with clear ideas into office, perhaps he or she will do less damage. I wrote an article titled El economista liberal y la política, the free market economist and politics, and there I explain what can be done within politicians' extremely limited capacity for action. Unfortunately, our country has maintained a tradition of interventionism until practically yesterday, and this accounts for the long-standing relative underdevelopment of Spain with respect to the other countries in the European Union. In Spain, being an entrepreneur has traditionally been frowned upon. Entrepreneurship has been stifled for centuries, since the Spanish Golden Age, in fact. Read the classic Spanish works from that period. In the 16th century, the three possible sources of work for a young Spanish man were the church, the sea, and the crown. Those were the options. A man could enter the church, he could cross the sea to the Americas to seek his fortune, or he could serve the king in the military. It was no one's ideal in life to work in the fields, in a small artisan's workshop, or in trade. One reason, among others, was that if someone got his hands dirty working, or devoted himself to trade, or to operating a small artisan's workshop, he was sure to be immediately labeled a new Christian. In other words, he would be associated with Jews and Moriscos, Muslim converts to Christianity, who worked in trade and enterprise. For almost 800 years, Spain fought against Muslim invaders. Americo Castro, in La Realidad Histórica de España, explains that after all of those centuries, without realizing it, we ended up imitating the worst flaws of our enemies. We ended up internalizing something which is characteristic of Islam, namely the waging of holy war against the infidel. And when we drove out Islam, we had to keep fighting the infidel, whether in North Africa or in the Americas, or within our own borders. We went after the infidel. Though Christians, we became like Islamists without noticing it. There is also the obsession with blood purity, typical of the Jewish people. We ultimately internalized that as well. Nobody could obtain an important government position without being screened for blood purity. One had to get a certificate. They were all forged, because if anything characterizes the blood of the Spanish, it is that it has been thoroughly mixed with that of the Jews and Moriscos. There was no liberal revolution in Spain, except a very fleeting one, which coincided with the glorious revolution of 1868. The Canavist Restoration was a restoration of interventionism, tariffs and regulations. And that is not to mention the dictatorship of Primo de Rivera, or the short-lived Republic, or General Franco. Interventionism and socialism, pure and simple. It was only after the Stabilization Plan of 1959 that the windows were opened to let in a little of the fresh air of the market economy, and with brilliant results. But the principal institutions, social security and the great rigidity of the Spanish labor market, both of which we have inherited from Franco, have not been effectively dismantled by any of the democratic administrations. Interventionism has been maintained, and it was only when Spain entered the European Union that economic liberty increased in relative terms, something which has already had a spectacular influence on the economic development of our country. Even so, recent polls show that among young Spanish university students, the idea of being an entrepreneur has yet to catch on. Few young people want to be entrepreneurs. Most want Papa State to solve all their problems. They want to take a public exam, get an easy job, avoid taking risks, and have everything guaranteed. Montesquieu identified the 3 capital sins of Spanish people as sloth, cruelty, look at Goya's The Disasters of War, and envy. And in Spain, success is frowned upon and immediately arouses envy. We are very envious people. This clashes culturally with the attitudes of people from other countries. If you visit the United States, you will find that winners are admired there. I lived in the US for 3 years, and I saw that when a person is successful in that country, everyone immediately wants to help her continue to be successful, and she is seen as a role model. However, in Spain, prizes are awarded only posthumously, or if everyone finds out a person has terminal cancer. There is so much envy in our country that it is common knowledge that certain very prestigious prizes, I will mention none in particular, must be awarded to foreigners. For every time they are given to a Spanish person, his or her colleagues become so envious that they break out in hives. This also contributes greatly to the discrediting of entrepreneurship and of the entrepreneurial spirit in Spain. However, things are gradually changing. If we compare the current situation in Spain to the one that existed 35 or 40 years ago when I began my academic life, then clearly a lot of progress has been made in the right direction, though we still have a long way to go. What are the essential measures to be taken? Years ago, I published an important article on the subject in several newspapers, El País and others. The article was called Un programa para la economía española, a plan for the Spanish economy. To tell you the truth, I published it over 35 years ago, and it is still relevant, because I repeat the same thing every year. I wrote, first of all, that we should immediately do away with inflation and reduce public spending. Spain later entered the European Union. Responsibility for monetary policy rests no longer with Spanish authorities, but with European ones. Still, the goal of no credit expansion remains a priority in order to avoid crises, and reductions in public spending, that is, austerity in the public sector, is fundamental. Second, I wrote that we should liberalize the economy as much as possible, especially the labor market. This is where we have the most progress to make. The unemployment rate in Spain is always twice as high as in the surrounding countries, precisely because our labor market is twice as rigid. Everyone knows what has to be done, but no one dares to bell the cat, politically speaking. Instead, politicians focus on keeping social peace, and that is a euphemistic way of referring to the problems highlighted by the public choice school, which we have just studied. Third, I wrote that we should lower taxes. Some progress has been made in this area, particularly from the Aznar years onward. A reform was adopted, and the progressive income tax was lowered. The highest rate, 56%, was reduced to 40%, in keeping with all the other tax reforms introduced in Western countries since the Reagan tax revolution. The inheritance tax was eliminated de facto in almost all of Spain's autonomous regions, and the Socialist Party abolished the wealth tax in 2008, though it was later re-established. Some progress has been made, though we still have a long way to go. Unfortunately, due to the crisis, the authorities took the opportunity to raise the VAT rate from 16 to 18%, and later to 21%. Also, another very mistaken measure, they increased the tax on income from movable capital, which is precisely the opposite of what they should have done, since it is important now to encourage the accumulation of capital. So in the future, when you hear a politician defending reducing the role of the state, cutting public spending, lowering taxes, and liberalizing the economy, especially the labor market, that is the candidate to vote for, because that is the direction we need to move in. Sadly, few politicians will speak in this way, and if they do defend these steps, they will do so timidly, and will have little power to change anything. However, at least now you have some guidelines that indicate the correct and appropriate path.